Hello, everyone. We want to welcome you again to another one of our live streams here as Danny and I today continuing to look kind of at the issue of Israel and Gaza and what's happening, but we're looking at it from another perspective. We're going to bring on two guests today. We've said all along that one of the best things that you can do is go talk to Jewish people, go meet Israelis, go talk to Palestinians, go meet Arabs, go meet a Muslim, go meet other Christians, and just kind of get different perspectives because it's really important here. And these different perspectives are going to be conflicting perspectives. Yeah. Let's just be honest with you. They're not all going to look at things the same way. But I think, Danny and I have done a live stream, I think, a couple of weeks ago on the campus protests and kind of getting different perspectives on that and what's happening and the rise of anti-Semitism. And that's really the angle that we want to take on today. So today we are really pleased to invite Rabbi Brumbach and Richard Harvey. Richard's been with us before, so welcome back. Richard is a Jewish follower, became a Jewish follower of Jesus in 1974. He studied theology at Bristol University. He pioneered the London Messianic congregation where he met his wife, Monica, who's also a Jewish disciple of Yeshua. They have 2 children and 3 grandchildren. Richard served with the church's ministry among the Jewish people, CMJ, was the director of Jews for Jesus, United Kingdom, and is presently a senior researcher. He's was an academic dean and director of the postgraduate studies at All Nations Christian College, where he continues to teach Hebrew Bible and Jewish studies. His PhD is published as Mapping Messianic Jewish Theology, a Constructive Approach. Richard is now an independent researcher in Messianic Jewish history and theology. Richard, welcome back. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
All right. And Rabbi Joshua Brumbach serves as senior rabbi at I'm not going to say this right, Rabbi. Simchat? Okay. Simchat?
Simchat Yisrael.
Thank you.
The joy of Israel.
Very good. Yisrael in West Haven, Connecticut. He's the president of the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council and adjunct faculty at Messianic Jewish Theological Institute at the King's University. He's currently completing a doctorate in Spiritus Institute for Jewish Learning and Leadership. His dissertation focused on protest theology and midrash on Psalms. He's the author of 2 biblical commentaries and numerous articles. So, Rabbi, thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
I appreciate it. So what we really want to address, is the current crisis in Gaza and even the growing troubles in the West Bank as well as maybe even the campus protests, which has been in the headlines for the past 8 months. But the rise of anti-Semitism, especially, that's really what I want to focus on there, is really the anti-Semitism angle of things. But let's kind of start with your stories. Maybe, Rabbi, we'll start with you. Kind of tell us about yourself, your family, your work. We kind of gave you a little bio, but feel free to interject as much as background as you'd like.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just give you something short and then you can always, ask follow-up questions. So I'm also, if it wasn't clear, also a Jewish follower of Jesus. Yeshua is the way we often refer to it. And so I lead a Messianic synagogue. It's a Jewish congregation that practices Jewish life and the holidays, all that stuff, but we approach it from what we like to say, Jewish life renewed in Yeshua, through the lens of Jesus. And I'm also an academic, and so I'm very much involved in a lot of these discussions from a wide variety of perspectives. My wife is also a Jewish believer, and her and I actually argue on all these topics all the time. I mean,
isn't that kind of like a Jewish way, though, right? Because
my wife is a lawyer who actually specializes in international law and is dealing with stuff right now. With the UN and other things. And so she's in the middle of all of this.
Okay.
So we're constantly talking about.
Maybe you could step off and bring her on.
Yeah, she actually, I was going to tell you, she'd be far better, and
right. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll be back next week with another live stream with,
yeah.
So go ahead. I interrupted you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's who I am. And where I am, we're right next to Yale campus, Yale University.
Okay.
And actually here in the New Haven area, there's actually 5 major universities here, not just Yale, although that's the one everybody knows, but there's Quinnipiac University and others. So obviously these campus protests have been a really big deal, especially at Ivy League institutions and the way that they've, the different schools have handled it. Obviously in the news, you see the heat that many of the university presidents have taken over their stances. In one sense, I'm so glad I'm not a university president because there's no right answer to this, right? And this is the heat that that is happening, because it doesn't matter which position you take, somebody's going to be upset. And it's a really, it's a difficult time to be on campuses right now, not only for Jews, but for others. For a lot of students, the majority of whom are not a part of these protests, many are starting to get really frustrated that their classes, their graduations are being interrupted or canceled because of a very present minority. And just this morning, I believe it's at Cal State LA, a school building has been taken over. This is in the news right now.
Right.
And not synagogue, the university president and other staff members are in the building. So they're essentially, it's a little harsh to call them hostages, but at the same time, they are being held against their will. Like, this is a huge problem.
Wow. Yeah. All right. Very good. Cool. Richard, kind of give us a little bit, kind of your background a little bit more and how you approach this issue.
Yeah, well, you can tell from my accent, I'm not from the USA. I'm third generation British born, but my father was born Anthony Adolf Hirschland, a German Jewish name, and Adolf was a popular boy's name until a certain Adolf came along. So my grandfather changed our family name from Hirschland. He didn't want a name that sounded German, didn't want a name that sounded Jewish. So it became Harvey, which is typically quintessentially British. Would you like a glass of Harvey's Bristol Cream Sherry? That's my mother's family come from Poland, just outside Krakow, a place called Tarnów, where half of the town, some 45,000 Jewish people, were just rounded up and sent to the gas chambers. And so my father's side, most of them came out of Germany, from Essen. But I've grown up in the European Jewish context. I was brought up Reformed Jewish, so we went to synagogue, but it was rather sort of secular, humanistic, but very strong family links. And I still have those links because my cousin is the senior rabbi now of that synagogue, and just about all my family are there on Shabbat. So I'm there either online or in person. I became a disciple of Jesus, of Yeshua, in the 1970s. And when I did, I thought my Christian friends were saying, now that you've become a Christian, you're no longer a Jew. Old past, the new has come. And my Jewish friends were saying, forget this Jesus business, come back to the synagogue, be a nice Jewish boy. And I realized, and that's what started me studying theology, that no, I'm fully Jewish. It's not a sin to be Jewish. You don't stop being Jewish when you find the Messiah. And I also want to be fully a disciple of Yeshua, of Jesus. I thought I was the only one, as many of us do, but I discovered that there was a growing movement in Israel, in the US, of Jewish people discovering the Messiah. And it was the roots phenomenon. People were holding on to their ethnic and cultural identities. And then as I studied more, I realized that this is something that's got a theological significance. I wasn't born by accident a Jew. I'm born with an identity that is God-given. And to be a Jewish disciple of Yeshua, as I know Rabbi Joshua finds, it's a challenging thing. You get the best of both worlds and double the headaches. And you're in the process of an identity construction as well, because for 2,000 years, the church and the Jewish people have often been adversarial and misunderstanding each other.
Right.
Just to set my own context I grew up with my parents talking about what had happened in the Holocaust. My mother had been evacuated in the war. My father had sort of ran away to join the Navy. But I realized that something terrible had happened. And it wasn't until I visited Germany and visited the camps and discovered for myself the sort of horrific history of the Holocaust that I was really deeply touched. And I think my own sense of Jewish and Messianic Jewish identity has often been tinged with that sense of being a victim, of being persecuted. I know that's not a good basis to define your identity.
Sure, yeah.
We want to define our identity in positive ways, what we affirm and, who God is for us. But inevitably the European experience is a bit like that.
Wow.
So very, very much so. I knew my wife, especially as a grandchild of Holocaust survivors, grew up in the, very similar sense of identity.
Yeah.
And it's like that for many diaspora communities who the diaspora is a result of trauma and genocide, not just for Jews, but Armenians and others. It's such a big definer of who we are.
Yeah.
And what Richard is saying is, I think, really important for people to understand, going back, not just in the sense of the way the Jewish community sees itself, which obviously also both taints and informs the way that we view what's happening in the world around us right now. But especially as Jewish followers of Jesus, like the way that we see ourselves is, we're not just like another kind of cultural approach to Christianity. Like, Jesus was Jewish, all the disciples were Jewish. And we believe that the way that we understand the text, the biblical text, is that we have a covenantal responsibility to continue to live as Jews, right? It's not just like a nice cultural thing that we can do, that God actually expects Jews to continue to live as Jews and remain Jews. Because we have a particular role that doesn't make us better or worse than anybody else. It just makes us unique in that perspective, that we join a huge line that started not only with Jesus and the early disciples and followers, but throughout history there have been pockets of Jews, of individuals here and there, small pockets, who continued to believe that Jesus was the Messiah, but continued to live as Jews. And so, it's a challenge, because for 1800 years it's been considered an oxymoron, right?
Yeah.
But even though this started as a movement within Judaism,
Right.
which they themselves called the way, right?
Yeah.
Right.
They didn't. The term Christian, most people don't realize, was applied to the followers of Yeshua. It says in
It's a
Acts.
derogative term. Yeah.
Right, but it also was a descriptor that wasn't immediately. It wasn't like.
Yeah.
This is who we are. They called themselves the way, but it was out, others who called them Christians. Obviously it stuck. But they saw themselves as, the practitioners of the right way to practice Judaism. Right. But, they did something which was amazing, is they took this message beyond Israel. Right. And I mean, Israel, as far as the people group, because even at that time, at the time of the New Testament, the majority of Jews live outside of Israel.
Right.
There's already a huge diaspora then. And you see this in books like Jude, and I think it's First Peter, that, it says to the 12 tribes who are in the diaspora. They're not writing to Jews in the land of Israel. They're writing to others. And so anyway, I just want to mention, this is an important part of who we are as Jewish followers of Jesus, is that it's integral. Like the whole idea of as a Messianic Jew is we're both, in my friend Dr. David Stern used to say that we're both 100% Jewish and 100%, believers in Yeshua, like Messianic, despite what people want to say. And the whole point is we don't have to choose one or the other, because we actually expect God, that these are supposed to go together.
Wow. Well said. It's interesting.
All right. So let's talk about your communities, and the Jewish community in particular that you guys are familiar with, in terms of you can discuss before October 7th and after October 7th, or just how has things changed since October 7th, and in what ways, especially the anti-Semitism, is that ratcheted up, and what does that look like, and what does that mean for you, and how are your communities processing all of this?
Yeah,
Richard, you want to go first?
Okay, I'll go first. Yeah. So I think for the Jewish community in Britain, and I'm speaking for the 300,000 or so that are officially part of the Jewish community, it's a small community. I wanted to mention philo-Semitism as well as anti-Semitism.
Okay.
Because it's so easy to get a distorted perspective on the negative. So Britain has a mixed history of love of the Jews and also hatred of the Jews from the time of the Norman conquest, 1066, when officially Jewish people came over with William the Conqueror. It's a long history that we were all expelled in 1290, and we weren't officially readmitted until 1665, when Oliver Cromwell unofficially allowed us back. and then the German Jews, the Sephardi Jews from North Africa and Spain, the Dutch Jews, and then the Russian Jews and Polish Jews came in waves of immigration in the 18th and 19th centuries. And we have the 20th century and, of course, the post-Holocaust generation. So we have a long history of a love-hate relationship being displayed towards us. And you read Dickens and Fagin, you read George Eliot and Daniel Deronda, you read Shakespeare and The Merchant of Venice, and you realize that the Jew has been treated as the other, sometimes with love and sometimes with hatred. And so the problem of anti-Semitism, I would also say as an academic, it's very difficult to define anti-Semitism.
Okay.
Because it's a very subjective term in many ways. Kenneth Marcus, in his book, The Definition of Anti-Semitism, says that if anti-Semitism is to be addressed, it must first be explained. And if it is to be explained, it must first be defined. And of course, the 1879 was the first usage of the term, which was really a choice that was used for political means, because Wilhelm Marr didn't want to call it anti-Judaism. So methodologically speaking, we need to know what we're talking about. But to cut to the chase, 580% increase in anti-Semitic incidents reported since October the 7th by Community Security Trust. This
is in Great Britain alone.
In Great Britain alone. So 589% increase in the number of incidents compared with the same period. And of those incidents, 2/3 occurred since 7th of October, 2,699. And that number has continued to go up. I don't have the June figures. But of course, this includes all types of anti-Semitic activity, from hate speech, literature distribution, abusive behavior, threats, damage and desecration of property, especially synagogues and community graveyards, assault, physical assault, and extreme violence. And so there's been a knee-jerk reaction. If I showed you the main Jewish paper, the Jewish Chronicle, the first 10, maybe 20 pages of it are all about reactions to the war in Israel, but often reflecting negative responses. And we've just got an election campaign going on at the moment. Tories, Conservatives. Keir Starmer's wife is Jewish, by the way. So he's really done as much as he could to get anti-Semitism out of the Labour Party. Conservative Party has also issues with racism in all sorts of ways. So the Jewish community is quite fearful on the surface. In fact, one of the Jewish security guys was told by the police that wearing a yarmulke in public was likely to cause an offense and a breach of the peace. So the chief rabbi tells us not to wear yarmulkes in public. And I know that if I walk down a street in London with a yarmulke on, I will get abuse.
Wow.
But then, in a way, because we're closer to Europe and we're closer to the reality of the genocide, it's like you're already attuned to be sensitive to these things. I said right at the start, it's so easy to spend your time opposing what you don't agree with that you lose sight of affirming what you do agree with, which is the plea for reconciliation, for repentance. I was yesterday at the Commonwealth prayer breakfast. I don't know if you know the Commonwealth. This is not the Ephesians 2 Commonwealth. What used to be the British Empire now became the Commonwealth.
Right.
They invited me to close with the Aaronic benediction in Hebrew.
Wow.
And I was amazed. There was, so many countries and nationalities represented in the Commonwealth, the major network of countries that unite together with loyalty of some sort to their British experience. And they were showing such love to the Jewish people. They didn't want to get politically into the intricacies of the conflict, but I felt so much accepted there as a Jew and as a Jewish disciple of Jesus. So we have to balance both the bitter and the sweet.
Right.
How
Right.
about you, Joshua?
So in the United States, there's, kind of similar patterns that have been happening. Anti-Semitism, after decades of, decreasing, since 2016, it's been on the rise, but then obviously October 7th exacerbated everything. And so across the country, anti-Semitism since October 7th has risen about 300% and about 400% or more on college campuses.
Okay.
And this ranges in similar to what Richard mentioned in the UK, is that ranges from hate speech and literature to arson and attempted arson on synagogues and Jewish community centers. Sadly, some of the greatest targets have been Holocaust institutions, whether they're museums, whether they're like monuments and memorials and stuff like this. And so it's been really difficult for the Jewish community. And a lot of people think that, oh, you're just being ridiculous or whatever, but this is happening on a daily basis. Right. And I think the challenge that all of us feel is, in one sense, especially in the US, where freedom of speech is a big deal, like that's something that we value, right? At the same time, when freedom of speech and legitimate criticism of any political entity, when it tips the scale and it really moves into anti-Semitism, this is really difficult. And it's hard for the Jewish community to hear people telling us to go back to the ovens and, you know what I mean? Like all this kind of stuff. It's a challenge for most of our existence, that there's always in every generation those who feel the world would be better without us. But yet statistically, as Mark Twain noted 100 years ago, the impact of the Jewish community on the world has been tremendous in medicine and all this kind of stuff. Like, would the world really be better off without the Jewish people? Every country that's expelled its Jews at some point has regretted it, just because Jews have tended to be an important part of the community, and again, like, it's not just the Jewish community. Immigrant populations are often play a big role on societies, right? And in the shaping and entrepreneurship and stuff like that. So it's not just the Jewish community, other communities too, but the Jewish community have historically been in an important one. And so it's definitely a difficult time, and it's easy to be discouraged and feel overwhelmed. At the same time, I have to remind myself that polls still show that 70-80% of people are still very supportive of the Jewish people in Israel, but that minority that's very vocal is getting more vocal, and the hostility is only getting stronger, and it's very unavoidable. There definitely are places too, not everywhere, but in the US, where wearing a kippah or any kind of other outward visible signs are not only discouraged, but it will, especially on college campuses and stuff like that. It's you're just inviting problems.
So how about for you guys? We're very interested in just your perspective on October 7th and the Israeli response to that. What are some of the lenses and the ways that you are viewing what's actually happening on the ground there?
Yeah, well, I'll just kick off because I landed in Israel on October the 7th.
Yeah, you did.
Oh, wow.
The plane, the captain said, there's some security concerns. Please disembark as quickly as possible. As we're on the bus on the way to the terminal, we have to all get down, lie on the ground. The bombs are going off above us. And, I don't normally arrive in Israel that way, but it was
wow.
fastest I got through immigration ever. And then because of various events, my wife said, come home. I came home. I was back in Israel in February, speaking at a meeting in Jerusalem, really trying to give some sort of encouragement and hope. And I was back 4 weeks ago, also teaching in Jerusalem. Like Joshua, we all have friends and family who are deeply caught up, deeply traumatized. It feels so unreal. My plea, actually, and this is one of the things, Rob, you and I and Joshua are involved in, is that we seek truth, peace, justice, and reconciliation.
Yeah.
And of course, the complexity of these issues and the depth of pain and suffering means that it's very, very hard
Yeah.
to have a conversation.
Sure.
And I was really struck by a cartoon in The Economist just recently, which is, and I think this feeds into some of the things that you're seeing on the campuses in America and around the world as well, that the political agendas of the extremes,
Right.
are drowning the voices in the middle.
Yeah.
And now any mediating attempts to have even a conversation, even a reasonable question about, not every Israeli believes in what is happening, not every Arab believes in, or every Palestinian agrees with what Hamas is doing. We are seeing such a major sort of shifting of tectonic plates. So my perspective is really just to be in prayer and trying to continue to foster dialogue and conversation. Truth is the first casualty of war.
Yeah, very good point.
So even that quote is a casualty because nobody can really pin it down. But to really try and get open discussion, despite the asymmetries of power, despite the violence that distorts truth. I love your term, determined truth. How can you seek truth without justice, peace, and reconciliation, and a willingness to repent and be reconciled? So that's my personal perspective. But of course, I'm probably very much to the left of both Messianic opinion and Israeli opinion. So I'll be interested in how Rabbi Joshua is handling these situations in his own sort of ministry in a Messianic congregation.
It's definitely a challenging time, and I've gotten flack even within my own congregation and heat by saying, you can be pro-Israel without being anti-Palestinian, right? You don't. And I think what I would like to comment on is I think what most people are really unfamiliar with is, number one, the level of atrocity that was that happened on October 7th and what is continued. Most people don't know that rockets have landed in Israel every single day. Just, yesterday there was about 210 or so rockets and missiles that were fired from the north. So everybody talks about the displacement of Palestinians, which is true. And, the situation in Gaza is really atrocious. It really is. But at the same time, nobody talks about the hundreds of thousands who were displaced in Israel, right? Not only from the south, but in the north.
In the north,
And although some people in the south have recently started to return, a lot of the people in the north have not along the border. And so in Israel, so I have not been to Israel since October 7th, but my wife has, and she'll be going there again in just a couple of, about a month or so. She'll be back in Israel. And it's really difficult because there are no, or at least when she was first there really aren't tourists. So instead the hotels are full of refugees, people that can't return or didn't return.
And you mean Israeli refugees?
Israelis. I mean, Israelis who had to flee. Their homes are either destroyed or the threats of violence are too great.
Especially in the north from Hezbollah, right?
Exactly. Right. And in, one of the things that the law firm I need to be careful about too much saying publicly, and so I don't want to identify my wife too much because she's got to lay low from me, a little bit.
This lady that you've heard some,
Well, but like her organization has set up these legal clinics in hotels to help these refugees who, for example, one of their clients is a kid who lost his parents, and so he needs now a lawyer to help him navigate. What do I do with the house and everything? I don't own, my parents owned this house. I have nothing. Like, my grandmother has to, get legal conservatorship of me in order to make decisions. And you know what I mean? There's all kinds of things that people aren't thinking about, and this ongoing conflict. I wish people understood that, the challenges that this poses both to Israel and to, the people of Israel and to Palestinians, right? It's obviously the Palestinians are receiving the worst end of the stick at the moment, if you could say. The other thing that I wish people understood, especially with all the talk that Israel is a racist entity and all this kind of stuff, is how diverse Israel is. Despite my own criticism of the way that the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians has over time resulted, and there's a whole history there that is complicated, and we don't have time to even get into the depths of. This didn't start on October 7th. It's been an ongoing conflict. Both sides, you can point the finger at times at both sides. It's a really complicated thing, but people don't understand the complexity of the situation. They also don't understand how diverse Israel is, right? That the fact that there are 2 million citizens of Arab citizens of Israel who don't live in it. I'm not saying there's not discrimination and there, but it's not apartheid. Like, there's no separate drinking fountains. Israelis and Palestine and Israeli Arabs live side by side in many cases, even though there might be in different neighborhoods and stuff, but they work together. Israeli Arabs are doctors and lawyers and serve in the government. There's a chief justice who is Arab, and he's the one who wrote the decision to condemn a previous prime minister of Israel and president of Israel, right? And so this doesn't happen in an apartheid world. A minority cannot, get away with convicting, a prior prime minister or something like that. Like, so, people, even the Jews come from all over the world, but it's not just Jews in the land of Israel. You have these, 2 million Arab citizens, as well as other minorities who live in Israel. It's a beautiful and diverse place where, the national languages are both Hebrew and Arabic, right? Are the two national languages. And so when you go to Israel, you see all the signs are always going to be, if they're official signs, it's always going to be in Hebrew, Arabic, and with English transliteration, right? That's what Israel is. It's this complex, real melting pot in many ways. And so there's so much here that even though there's always room for criticism, and maybe not, Richard and I have our own differences, but but the one thing that him and I agree on is that part of responsible citizen, I'm not a citizen of Israel, but we all feel like responsible citizenship, whatever country we're a part of, the UK, the United States, whatever other country, good citizenship requires accountability to the governments in which you're a part of, if you have that ability, right? If you live in a dictatorship, a dictatorship or something where criticism is not allowed. But luckily, at least, Richard and the rest of us live in places where we can be vocal. We can be both supportive and vocal. And that's what it means to be a Zionist too. I think it's unfortunate that the term Zionism has taken on a demonic entity in the sense of like the accusation, Zionism equals racism and all that stuff. It simply means that Jews have, any sense of whatever you think that means, but a right to inhabit our ancient homeland, right? Just as any other people do, right? This is the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, is over this idea of the rights to land, right? And, they both have legitimate claims. And whenever you want to try to erase the other, you're always, that's a problem, no matter what conflict it is, obviously I have my feelings and all kinds of stuff, but anyway, that's just to kind of get the ball rolling on some of these points.
Excellent. Hey, let me interject a quick commercial break here. As Determined Truth is a 501c3 nonprofit, Danny and I work with 100 pastors or more in India every single week, trying to help prepare and equipping them, as well as being a voice to the evangelical church, primarily in the United States, with blogs and podcasts and live streams and our YouTube channel. We encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. It just helps the algorithm. Once we get to 1,000 subscribers, we'll get more visibility there. And we're trying to bring voice to these issues of balance and perspective, of different sides and different understanding, so that really, and our tagline is challenging the church to be the church, so that we really can help the church focus on what it means to follow Christ and what it means to follow us. You might not agree on all the things that we're doing and all the things that we believe, but our mission and our heart really is to challenge the church to be kingdom-minded people that imitate Christ our Lord, that are a light to the earth and a salt to the nation. So we want to encourage you that. We have a series that we're doing right now on the church and politics. We've been doing this series for a long time on the church and the Israel-Gaza conflict, as well as a number of other things as well. And we have another live stream coming up at 10 o'clock this morning, Eastern time, or Pacific time, an hour and a half, understanding glory and violence and what that means when you take away people's glory, when you take away their identity, how they respond with violence. And so I want to encourage you to enjoy it, to join that live stream as well. So if I can ask, what are maybe a twofold question, or what are your thoughts on Israel's response to October 7th, and how can we, and I'm asking this for myself specifically, help us understand, what does legitimate criticism of Israel look like, and what's not legitimate criticism of Israel, but actually follows into the anti-Semitism. So a two-pronged question there.
Wow, great question.
Thank you.
As I hear you just saying what you're doing in your ministry, Rob, and in the other aspects of your programming, I see you're wanting to determine truth, and you're wanting to elevate Yeshua, Jesus, for the whole, so the church is fully the church. So what does legitimate criticism look like? Well, I think of people like Hannah Arendt. I don't know if you know her.
No.
Great Jewish philosopher, expelled from Germany, but escaped the Nazis. Then she covered the Adolf Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. And she wrote a report on this, and she used the phrase, which got picked up and is now a cliche, the banality of evil. And she basically explained how Eichmann, he just didn't have any feeling for what he was doing. He allowed atrocity. He put into plan an atrocity program. But what she really got into trouble was criticizing the way that Israel was using this trial as a showpiece. And I think that although she got torn to shreds by many Israelis, she was criticizing from within. My observation, and I'm the Brit here, and you guys are all in the States. I was just in America doing a dialogue on the Israel war with a friend of ours. I think you know him, Daniel Banora, a Palestinian Arab Christian doing his PhD at Notre Dame in the Quranic studies. And I've known him because he and I have been involved in reconciliation initiatives. He's been at Bethlehem Bible College. We've had something called the Lausanne Initiative on Reconciliation in Israel, Palestine. We sat down together, about 10 Messianic Jews, 10 Palestinian Christians. We didn't agree at all, but we tried to narrow the areas of disagreement. And the report we wrote had side by side Messianic Jews. Many of us believe the restoration of the state of Israel is a fulfillment of prophecy or a sign of God's providential activity. For my Palestinian friends, it's the Nakba, it's the catastrophe. And so how do you even begin to talk in terms of justice, peace, and reconciliation? I think the problem with criticism from outside is that unless you're a real stakeholder, you don't have a right to speak. You only can advocate for one side or another, or position yourself in a peacemaking role. And I follow Lederach's Christian Mennonite peacemakers ideology here. You can't really get involved in somebody else's fight unless you really have good strategy. And so I think legitimate criticism comes from within. And I'm actually proud of the fact that Israel is a place where you still have a very healthy democratic discussion about these things. And some Israelis, including Orthodox Jewish Haredi Israelis, are writing and speaking out in these situations. People like Shaul Magid, Israeli ex-army serviceman rabbi, has just written a book. He's based in New York now, advocating for a whole new understanding of this. I think there is a legitimate way of criticizing any government. And in fact, international law was put together by Jewish lawyers to bring Nazi war criminals to justice. And although international law is not perfect, and I know America and Israel haven't signed up for it, I'm sure, I don't know if Rabbi Joshua would agree with his wife as a lawyer, it's at the moment the best thing we've got. And both Hamas and the Israeli government are being called to give an answer to the possibility of alleged war crimes. And whether or not they're guilty, and whether or not this is just a politicizing of the issue, I think we have to have some standards by which all regimes, all powers are accountable. I'm not convinced that the just war argument, which many try to use for the reason to go to war, the conduct in war, and the legitimate results of war, really work today in the 20th century complicated landscape, because we don't have two states at war. We have asymmetries of power, but we have to try and find ways to do justice and pursue justice at the same time as trying to get people to agree. And this conflict could be solved if there was enough international will and moral courage to bring all these parties together. And in fact, the agendas of both groups are themselves, in a way, self-preservation, but also self-serving. And we have to recognize that we're in a network world where we have to work together.
Joshua, before you answer, Richard, can I push back a little bit just for clarification's sake? One is, are you therefore saying that there's no place at all for criticism of Israel? Let's say for myself as an American Christian who's not invested in Israel nor in Palestine, and would not the fact that the United States is involved in this, and secondly, the American Christian Church is so supportive of this, provide a platform at least for me, a person like myself, to have a little bit of a voice, or what? How do you push back?
Well, yeah, you do, but my observation is that this is the American way of seeing the issues, which is filtered through a very Americanocentric worldview.
Yes.
And in fact, if you look at the history of Christian Zionism, which I've been teaching about, Christian Zionism as a political movement of Christians supporting the state of Israel for eschatological reasons, they see it as a fulfillment of a prophetic scheme, and also to replicate or mirror their own sense of chosenness and having a manifest destiny. And the way that plays into the American evangelical subculture and America, forgive me, I'm talking about things I don't know about, but as an external observer, it seems to me that criticism of Israel is almost a self-reflective way of saying, how could we be constructing our identity as Americans in a way that built on a sort of founding fathers, pilgrim fathers, Israel's destiny being mirrored by us? And the same thing is happening now with the pro-Palestinian protests, because the younger generation and the campus things, as I understand it, and I'm reading some very left-wing political commentators, so you can probably tell me off for doing that, Peter Beinart and people like that, is that this is not people who are deeply involved in these issues, but these are people who would have been protesting the Vietnam War back in the 60s. This is a legitimate form of seeking for justice, but the issues are very simplified. And of course, Israel is only, as we've been saying, some 12 million people there. The Jewish people are an ant compared to the 2.4 billion people who call themselves Christians, and the size of America. What are you, 300 million people with all the diversity? So you're looking at an ant from the position of an elephant, or a bear. I don't know which one you guys
You just got political on us right there.
I'm very naughty. Forgive me.
Yeah. That's okay.
What I'm really trying to do is point to the asymmetries of size and scale. And as Joshua was saying as well, the microcosm of Israel, the macrocosm that's there in Israel, the diversity, is not reflected on the campuses of America. And it's not reflected in the political sort of sound bites that you're hearing within an American context. It's a sort of, so for me, legitimate criticism is when you're within a community and not just when you're speaking from the outside. And of course, I hope that the American government is going to really be an honest broker in bringing peace in the Middle East. And of course, war is big business, and post-war reconstruction is even bigger business. And far be it for me to impugn the integrity of the motivations of any politics. The British are the same. But I think we have to be careful when we are bringing our criticisms to be self-reflective and self-critical about our own issues and agendas.
All right. There's some interesting thoughts, but we're running low on time here. Let me get Rabbi Joshua to get your thoughts. What are your thoughts on October 7th and Israel's response, and what does legitimate criticism of Israel look like?
Yeah, I'll try to be succinct. And I want to push back a little bit on some of the things that Richard was saying, only because I understand the complexity of all of this. And I think that there is room for, obviously the best form of criticism can be from the inside, because you know what's going on in a level that's different. At the same time, I think there is legitimate room for criticism from those on the outside. In fact, my wife, who was just at a big international meeting over the last few days, was talking to a Christian pastor who was talking about the difficulty he finds himself in Christian space, meaning that there's, in the world of what we can call, Christian Zionism, is of the two primary entities that represent Christian Zionists. I'm not going to mention the groups, or maybe I can, whatever.
Sure,
is on one hand you have like CUFI, Christians United for Israel, where there's absolutely no room to say anything negative about Israel or to criticize. And if you do, like this pastor said, he's found himself out, right? That you are pushed aside and you're no longer welcome. At the same time, there are other groups out there where if you say anything positive about Israel within a Christian context, you are pushed aside, right? Mm-hmm. And that's especially with groups on more of the mainline side, where you are not allowed to also ever say anything positive. So the problem is that not only is it a complex discussion between, for example, Israelis and Palestinians over the politics of this that are happening on campuses, but even among those who are pro-Israel, like this is a challenge even within the Jewish community and certain organizations. Again, it's the same way. If you speak too positively about Israel or too negatively about Israel, you'll find yourself ostracized. So the challenge is dialogue. Not only do we have this in a political sense in the world, but one of the things I want to push back on is I love the idea that the world has the ability to hold Israel accountable. The problem is it's not able to do that.
It's not willing to do that, right? The
problem is the hypocrisy of the world towards Israel. And I am so angry right now, just from being with my wife, who is literally on the inside of all of this, what's happening with, for example, the UN, right? And the politics of it. When you have some of the deciding chairs on, for example, the Security Council and stuff by Iran or China or Russia, who are these people to tell Israel what to do? Russia is in a war where they are also committing war. I don't want to say also. They clearly are. I also want to push back on the ideas, as critical as I am in the way that Israel is handling things. What do you expect Israel to do? Any government in their right mind would never not respond to an incident in which 1,200 people were just slaughtered. And I don't mean they were just shot or they were bombed. They were raped. They were burned. They were mutilated. Like, there are still 120 some hostages still in Gaza. Many of those women were raped on a regular basis. They were beaten. They were starved. Like, you know what I mean? Many of those hostages have now died in captivity. It's a horrible situation. And so to also expect Israel to do nothing, and negotiating sounds great, but you can't negotiate with terrorists. It's never worked, right? It's never worked for ISIS. It's never worked for, like, none of these. They don't want to negotiate. They didn't do this to negotiate, right? Hamas has made it very, very clear they're not really interested in negotiating. I mean, there's also a side in which you could argue the side, for, with the Netanyahu, government. But I think we're not dealing with a simple solution here. And I think this is what I'm so frustrated about. It's not only the hypocrisy towards Israel. Again, there is legitimate criticism. What I would identify just really fast is legitimate criticism to me would be when you are criticizing policies or administrations or specific issues, that is okay. That's when you're, more on the side of legitimate criticism of Israel. When you say that any entity or people group no longer have a right to exist or should be pushed into the sea or anything like that, that is illegitimate criticism. And obviously whenever, and obviously this happens in every conflict from World War II and other things, is when you are in a conflict, it's easy to demonize. For example, in the United States here, we rounded up Japanese Americans and we put them in intern camps. They were not extermination camps. There is a difference, but it was still wrong on all kinds of moral and ethical and legal levels. And so to vilify and demonize Jews all over the world, who in many cases have zero connection to Israel. Most of them have never been there. They don't, ever plan to go there, and so to them, to assault them and hold them accountable for the government of a different entity, that's wrong. Right. Yeah. And also for people, Richard made a great comment earlier, which is true, is that despite Israel's shortcomings, it is the only true democracy in the Middle East, right? It's a place in which the courts do hold it when soldiers do commit crimes or whatever, they are held accountable, right? This isn't something that's just ignored or that they're actually encouraged. This is not a genocide. You can argue that maybe there are individual circumstances that have not been handled well or whatever, but I would argue this, part of this is that the term genocide has been hijacked, right? And if everything is a genocide, like I've, recently on the news, or even hear about things towards animals and stuff, this is a genocide. It's like, if everything's a genocide, then nothing's a genocide. Right. And so we've got to be able to talk about legitimate war crimes and things like this without always throwing everything to a genocide. What happened on October 7th was a genocide. People were targeted specifically because of who they are. Right. Palestinians are not targeted because they're Palestinians. Like there's, unfortunately, a lot of these people are caught in the middle of a conflict. Right. And so this is a really difficult situation, not only on the ground in Gaza or between countries in the Middle East, but even on the world stage, right? This isn't a simple playing field in which you can even just call that countries can hold even Israel accountable. I don't believe they can, because we're not seeing that, right? Instead of, it's a political move. Even with the ICC recently, the head of the ICC who issued the edict is basically just a puppet of his own Middle Eastern government, right? He cannot rule any other way than what he will be allowed to by his own government. Like, and South Africa, really, of all people, who they won't let this go. They, in many ways, apartheid never ended in South Africa, right? And there's big problems in their election recently because people realize it's not so much better there. And so they're the least person to be, criticizing it. They have, again, self-preservation by accusing Israel of all of these things in which they're just holding the mirror up to themselves is a big problem. So anyway,
there's been so much that's been said, certainly, right?
Keep going, but I won't.
And there's a number of things that I would disagree with in terms of what's going on. But, and again, and I asked the question with honest integrity, saying, okay, listen, I do hold some criticisms of Israel. You asked the question, what's Israel to do? And I guess I can almost respond like, well, what's the Palestinians to do when they're under oppression, in Gaza? And maybe my quick response to what would Israel to do would be, well, I think 37,000 civilians, or whatever number of civilians are included in that 37,000, say 20,000 of them are women and children are civilians. That's too much. So I think there is something that Israel could do.
I don't disagree, but just to
Okay,
push back a little bit on is, number one, we've never taken the actual terrorists' numbers for anything before. And yet that's what we're doing. There's been no even questioning of those numbers until recently. I agree with you that the numbers are high, they're terrible, but there's never been an urban conflict that has actually had as low of civilian numbers. The other thing, trust me. Go look at Mosul. Go look at what the United States did in Mosul and other places. We did not take the steps that Israel has as far as phone calls, dropping leaflets, and anything. And again, I'm not. There is room for criticism.
Let me just stop you really quickly, just because the question that I really want to focus on, though, is how and what are the parameters for someone like myself or to criticize Israel and to say, well, I don't agree, Rabbi Joshua, with what you're saying. I think Israel could have done more. Where is that line where I need to be careful about crossing because of the implications for the Jewish community? Go ahead, Richard.
Well, I mean, the word criticize is from the Greek word kriteo, meaning to judge. So negative criticism is where you just point out what's wrong. But judgment is making right judgments for justice. So I would actually like to change the whole discourse, Rob. I would like to change it from adversarial discourses. Two wrongs do not make a right.
Right.
And whatever the numbers are, I agree with Rabbi Joshua, but whatever the levels of injustice on either side, we have got a situation where there is a negative adversarial discourse, which just sort of it separates everyone. You're in the business of determining truth for a constructive purpose, so the criticisms have to be positive. What are you advocating for, not what are you criticizing against? And I just know that it needs to be peace, justice, truth, reconciliation, seeking peace and pursuing it. Blessed are the peacemakers. I find that the negative criticism on both sides drowns any reasoned discussion.
So let me follow that up quickly. Richard was saying, what's the hope for peace? Is it there? Is it possible? Do you think there is a path, even in the middle of what we are now, toward a peaceful resolution of this?
Yeah, you have to have a theology of hope, and hope is always one of the processes that you need in reconciliation. And in fact, we're probably in a cycle, and I don't know whether it's this is the biggest event since the Holocaust for my people,
for the Jewish community.
So it is going to change a lot of things. And in the short term, we're all, if we're not professional politicians and diplomats, we're all blinded by it. But the agendas, I just point out, post-war reconstruction is such big business. The contracts are already being decided. But on the more sort of aspirational level, the hope is that violent conflicts can be solved. Northern Ireland, South Africa, despite
that was the point I was going to make. You can negotiate with terrorists. It has happened before.
Well, actually, the sad thing is that the logic of suicide terrorism is to change the worldview. It's not so much just the physical destruction; it's changing mentalities. But I do long for peace, and despite the fact that the UN is not perfect, and despite the fact that International Court of Justice is not perfect, it's the best thing we have at the moment. And it seems to me that the biblical, one of the key attributes of Hashem, of God, is justice. And that justice is a relational justice, which eventually is Israel and the nations reconciled in the body of Messiah. And I'm not one of those who's saying, well, it's all just going to burn away and we shouldn't bother to try. We should be socially engaged and politically engaged. That's why it gets so messy. It's why it's so hard to get anything done. But yeah, the hope is that we do pray, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And we have to do everything we can to work for that. And really, Rob, my plea is, what are you doing constructively? Because just bringing a negative criticism is not building for peace. So how do you build for peace?
Yeah, that's a great
well,
point.
Richard, yeah, that's a great question. And I think if you listen to like the very first live stream I did on this whole topic, my whole plea was the church should be advocating for a just peace for the sake of all people. So I think I have been offering a positive framework saying this is what the gospel and the kingdom looks like, and this is what we should be advocating for, and here's how we go about it. So I hope I've been doing that, Richard.
Oh yeah, well, my apologies. No, I don't know.
No,
but
no problem at all. No problem.
Let's spend some time constructing the scenarios for after this horrible war. I mean, I surveyed the.
Or how about scenarios for ending this war?
Yeah, well,
right. Also,
you need to have some good military strategists, but I'm already thinking, and others are thinking of this as well. What does it look like after this? And how do we prevent it from turning like this again in another 10 years' time? Or, God forbid, having an ongoing sort of guerrilla warfare thing. We've had a cold peace for about 10 years. You could call it that. And that was the situation in Northern Ireland. But we have to go beyond a cold peace to a real reconfiguration of the situation there. You could call it one state, no state, two-state solution. It doesn't really matter what you call it. There has to be some sort of practical implementation that will work. And
and that values the human dignity of all persons, right? And recognizes the need for security, the need for humanity, the need for dignity of everyone, right?
Right. And just to echo, like, I think the positive approach is really important. And again, emphasizing that it's okay to criticize policies, stuff like that. At the same time, people have to want peace, right? One of the things we are seeing with for example, the Abraham Accords and others is countries willing to now say, like, I'm willing, I don't agree with you, and we can argue over plenty of points, but I agree that you have a right to exist, and let's figure out a way to live together. Right.
Yeah.
You know, in the same way, like with Gaza in 2005, when Israel turned it over to the Palestinians, there was no fence around it. Right. That unfortunately ideologies and choices, plenty of Arabs within Israel chose to exist within, to exist with the state of Israel in existence. And, and others have as well. And as long as people are willing to acknowledge the humanity of the other. And I think if we can get to that point, to see the humanity of one another, to look each other in the eye and say, I see that, especially from a biblical perspective, that you are B'Tselem Elohim, created in the image of God, and that we have a right to treat each other with dignity and respect, then we can go far. But it takes, and I would just say that I really, truly believe that believers in Yeshua, Jesus, whatever stripe and, color, whatever, that we're coming from, we should be leading in this. We are supposed to be the people who are like longing and praying for peace and dignity for all people.
Exactly. Amen. Yeah.
Amen.
Hey, gentlemen, thank you so much. There's so many more things that I think maybe we'll have to continue this conversation again, but I appreciate it. And again, our prayers are for you and for the Jewish community. Our prayers, of course, are for peace and justice in this land, for the sake of Palestinians and for the sake of Israelis and for the sake of Jews. And for the sake of the church being the church, to model and imitating Christ and to make him known by loving our neighbors and loving our enemies. That's kind of what we've been trying to do. So I want to thank you for your time. We've obviously gone a little bit over the hour, but I appreciate your willingness to do this. And
thanks you.
And maybe we'll come back again and continue this conversation. I appreciate it. So Danny, anything that you wanted to add?
No, I have a million questions. I think it would be great to do this again. I really appreciate your honesty and your even the points where you guys don't see it exactly what your perspectives are. For those of us from the as you said, from the outside of this, trying to know how to speak into it, your perspectives are so valuable and so helpful to us. So thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you.
And those of you watching live, we apologize. We didn't get to your comments and questions. We did notice some of them and try to address them themselves, but we thank you for participating, and feel free to like this episode and share it with others. So thank you so much.
All right.